If you watched my show on Black love and Black women, then you don't want to miss today's show on Black love and Black men. We heard the female perspective, and today we are hearing what Black men have to say about Black love, marriage, and relationships. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is a special report with Areva Martin.
My guest today wrote a provocative article for Yahoo News in which he states that Black men are misrepresented in the media and in academic research, where they are often portrayed as incapable of monogamous relationships and are hypersexual in order to overcompensate for their inability to be breadwinners. He is here today to set the record straight. Joining me is Dr. Armon Perry. He is a professor at the University of Louisville Kent School of Social Work and the author of Black Love Matters: Authentic Men's Voices on Marriages and Romantic Relationships. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Perry.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
So I got to start, Dr. Perry, with your book topic and the subject matter. Why this book on this topic at this time?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a professor here at the University of Louisville, and most of my research revolves around fathers and their involvement with their children. But it's tough to talk fatherhood unless you're talking about the relationships in which those guys are engaging their children. And oftentimes that happens through either marriage or through their connection with their children or the parents, the children's primary caregivers, and in most cases that's mom. So necessarily, in order to talk fatherhood, you have to talk about relationships and the ways in which those things impact men's ability to take active roles in their kids' lives.
So I know in the book you looked at a diverse group of Black men and you studied their attitudes and their behaviors around marriage and romantic relationships. How did you pick those men? I think there were about 33 men who were part of your study. How were those men selected?
Yeah, well, there was a larger study that happened before that. So the 33 guys that I followed for the course of 4 years for Black Love Matters, they were a subset of about 162 men who completed surveys about marital attitudes. And as you mentioned, I was looking to get a diverse cross-section of Black men. So we recruited men out of barbershops, out of philanthropic organizations, out of social service agencies, out of college campuses, so that we could get men who span the socioeconomic, educational, religiosity, and other types of spectrums as well, again, to make sure we were getting a diverse perspective.
Now, I know, Dr. Perry, one of the things that I've read about your work is that you believe that so much of the academic research and studies that have been done around Black men and relationships really have focused on Black men who are in lower income classes, and that you wanted to look at a broader spectrum. Is that because you believe that those men who have been the subject of academic research don't reflect, the broader spectrum of Black men?
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it when you used the word subjects, right? So I think that traditionally and historically, academic research has treated Black men and Black families as if they were subjects, right? So the objects to be tinkered with and tinkered on, rather than allowing them to express their own perspectives, their own attitudes, and share with people their own lived experiences through firsthand accounts. And so I was looking to counter that by, again, engaging men in conversations about their experiences and relationships and talking to them as opposed to simply talking about them.
So give us some idea in the book, the kinds of things that you wanted to talk to these Black men about. Like, what were the questions that they were asked and that you were, collecting data on, I should say, over this 4-year period?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was interested in the men's experiences in relationships. I was interested in what their thoughts and beliefs about marriage were, where those things came from, what types of early relationship experiences they had, and how those things shaped their relationship patterns over the years to come. We spent time talking about ideal marriage mates from not only a physical standpoint, but also temperament, personality. Just wanted to get into what it was that the guys were thinking about relationships, where those thoughts and ideas came from, and what were the experiences that shaped whatever those thoughts and ideas were.
So I I read an article published, I think it was in HuffPost or one of the online sites, written by a Black woman that said Black men hate Black women. And she went on to describe, give evidence for her point. She's not a lawyer, but she made this very persuasive case. She pointed to rap music. She pointed to, issues of colorism. Black men saying, hey, they hope their baby has curly hair. They hope their babies have green eyes. And she just pointed to all of these, examples of what she thought was, evidence that Black men hate Black women. Help us understand in your survey and the men that you talk to, what their impression is of Black women.
Sure. Well, they certainly didn't hate Black women, right? So I'll also step back and say this, that, and I mentioned this in the book and as a part of the conclusion, I think it's important that we all do this thing, and that is any critique of Black families has to also be accompanied by a critique of the larger society that shapes the lived experiences of Black families, right? So in other words, Black people aren't just operating in isolation, in a vacuum here in the United States of America. We've all been socialized in a context that really does hate Black people, right? And so as a consequence of that, some of us internalize some of those things and we do manifest them in some of our behavior. So I would not completely and summarily dismiss the conclusion that the author that you mentioned came to, but I would also say that if it is not accompanied by a critique of the larger society, that it's somewhat incomplete, right? But beyond that, the men that I talked to, the men that I spent time with, and again, keep in mind, I followed these guys for a period of 4 years, right? So we were able to trace the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows in their relationships. And they absolutely did not hate Black women. Many of them revered Black women. Many of them pointed to their relationships and their connections with their wives and their girlfriends as being critical and pivotal in shaping who they were as men, right? So almost nothing, again, at least in my experience anyway, could be further from the truth.
So what did they tell you? I mean, did you hear these men, we're going to talk about the men you studied in particular, talk about issues of colorism, saying that they, had a preference for lighter skinned Black women or, women who had a certain texture of hair or a certain eye color? Did that come up? I don't want to say that this woman is just making this up, because we do know that colorism is a big issue in the Black community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even here recently, there's been discussion and conversations about people who have a preference for what they deem as exotic women. And I think exotic is sort of code for people who have European-ish features or whatever the case may be. It would be erroneous for me to summarily dismiss that there was a good bit of truth in that sort of conclusion that the author that you mentioned came to. So again, I'm about using the data to inform my decision rather than just sort of speculating. So what I would say is, when we had discussions, because we talked to the guys about, again, ideal marriage mates, and a part of that was physical appearance. And so the guys that I talked to, they spent less time talking about complexion and skin tone. Now, they did have an overwhelming preference for more voluptuous and fuller figured, or to use their words, thicker women, right? And so I think that stereotypically those are traits and qualities and attributes that have been ascribed to African-American women over and above other types of women. But there wasn't much in terms of clear distinctions in terms of skin tone or hair color or hair texture or things of that nature. Again, it ran the gambit. Keep in mind, we were interviewing guys who span the age continuum, the socioeconomic continuum, the educational continuum. So we had guys who talked about preference for short hair, guys who had preferences for long hair, relaxed hair, natural hair, and things of that nature. So again, there was a little bit of everything in there. So there wasn't a clear sort of a distinction as it relates to physical appearance and the ways in which the guys were leaning in terms of their preferences.
As it relates to physical appearance, I want to stay on that for a minute. Did you see any trends as it related to age? So, were younger men more inclined to say they like the more, as you use the word, thicker women versus, say, older men? Because we've seen, beauty trends in this country have changed dramatically. And actually, we're going to be doing a show on body we have done shows on body positivity, that movement. And, depending on what you watch on social media, there are some women who are embracing their curves and embracing, being full-figured women, and then there are other women who really struggle to be, incredibly thin, who, aspire to have the more European, size body. So did that break down in the men that you studied, by any age category or income category or any trend that you noticed?
I think in some ways there was more of a propensity for the younger guys to talk about having a preference for what they would describe as thick women. And it may indeed be that is consistent with sort of contemporary society and people being more aware and people being more receptive and embracing all types of physical appearances and body images and things of that nature. I think that largely that's a good sign, I think. As a black man who is married to a black woman, and I have a black daughter, and I obviously have a black son as well. So I think that black is beautiful in all of its shades. I think that we are the strongest, most resilient, most diverse group of people walking the face of the earth. And the more and more we get away from internalizing deficit frame messages about who and what we are and spend more of our time embracing who we are and spreading that love, I think that we're well on our way to being able to more accurately and more consistently have the types of healthy, positive relationships that are sustainable that our community needs in order to strengthen itself and get done what it is we need to get done as a people.
No, excellent point. And Dr. Perry, in that article that I mentioned that you wrote for Yahoo News, you say that media also, distorts the reality of black men, black relationships. And in particular, I was drawn to the point you made about media portrayal of black men being incapable of being in monogamous relationships. Help us understand from your book, from your research, what did you find out, or what have you found out about black men as it relates to monogamy?
Yeah, so I think the point that you touched on is really, really important, and you know this as well as, if not better than most, right? Media is in shaping the thoughts and ideas and the perspectives of the people. There's a reason why advertisers spend millions and billions of dollars, right, on ads, whether they be print ads or digital, whatever the case may be, because these things work. And when you take a look at what we see and what we observe and what we receive as it relates to black families, more often than not, if there's a black man involved, he has some sort of a deficit, right? And oftentimes the deficit is his inability, it seems, to be committed to one woman. Even if you look at the most popular, whether it be television shows or movies, if and when there's a black man in a lead role, there's a high probability.
There's the Playboy figure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a high probability that he's not going to be committed to one woman. And I think there's also this sort of a false dichotomy where we sometimes see in media where if you want to date a black man, or if you want to be in a relationship with a black man, you have two choices. You can either have the man who is, as you described, the playboy, who is super successful. He may have a six-figure income and a white-collar job or whatever the case may be, but he's going to be a womanizer. He may even be abusive in some ways. Or you can get the faithful black man who's going to be down on his luck in between jobs and just sort of struggling to kind of sort of make it. And what the message that sends is that, again, there's this sort of a false dichotomy in the community where you can either pick one or the other. And given our interest in the priority that we place on economic finances and success in our country, more often than not, people opt for the successful playboy who, for whatever reason, doesn't have the ability, interest, or willingness to treat his black woman the way that she needs and deserves to be treated. So I think that's problematic.
I'm going to agree with you, Dr. Perry, that media definitely, portrays black men in a false light oftentimes, and we do glorify in the media this player kind of man who has the foreign sports car and the Gucci loafers and spending big money at the club, throwing it up, bottle service, the whole nine. But are are we also in our own community glorifying that man, and are we creating that man oftentimes in our households? The little Johnny that's so cute is going to be, a killer with the ladies. He's going to kill the ladies. So are we also complicit, in building that man type, that male type up to be the prototype man that women should want?
Yeah, absolutely. I would not disagree or push back against that at all. Again, I mean, it's been said that art imitates life and vice versa. So in many ways, these things are cyclical and they feed into one another. So I would not disagree or push back against that at all. But again, the only thing I would say, just to sort of add to that, not to refute it or push back, is that, again, any critique of our community has to be accompanied by a critique of the larger society that shapes it, right? So when we talk about things like misogyny and patriarchy and things of that nature, those things predate, say, for instance, hip-hop culture. Right, America was patriarchal and was misogynist before hip hop ever came onto the scene. And so, what's interesting to me, in terms of a critique and in terms of an analysis, is that we spend large amounts of time doing the sort of reflection work and looking inward at our communities, and I don't think we spend enough time looking outwardly at the institutions that shape our communities. So again, I would not disagree. I would just attempt to add to it to say there's a broader sort of a perspective that we need to take into account, I think.
Well, I'm glad you brought up hip hop and hip hop culture, because a part of what that author that wrote that Black men hate Black women pointed to was rap songs and the lyrics, in many of the songs, popular songs that are played on the radio, played in nightclubs, played in homes and in cars. What did your men, the 33 men that you studied, and the broader, men that participated in your study, say about that? Some of the lyrics. I was just myself in Las Vegas. I was at a nightclub, and some of these lyrics, you had to turn your head and say, "Did they just say what?" Yeah. And everybody, knows the words, and everybody's shouting the words out, and you're like, "Okay, I think they did say that." So
yeah, it's interesting, and so I will not attempt to defend the indefensible, right? So I'm not an apologist for hip hop culture. I am an admitted hip hop head, right? I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so some of my fondest memories are listening to my favorite artists and their new music that came out. And I readily admit that much of it is stuff that I would not let my 10-year-old son listen to, right? So I'm not going to be a hypocrite in that regard and attempt to defend it. Again, but what I will say in terms of the guys in the study, what was interesting is that many of them found themselves not only being influenced by that, to your point, but what was really interesting was they oftentimes used hip hop culture, particularly the younger guys anyway. They used hip hop culture to sort of narrate their experiences. So in other words, we would have a conversation or a discussion. I would ask someone, "Talk to me again about your ideal marriage mate," and then it wouldn't be all that uncommon for someone to say, "Well, I want to ride or die chick," and that's a reference to an old rap song. And so they were talking about a specific type of a personality and set of traits and qualities and loyalty from that mate that they felt was desirable. There was another instance where a young man I was interviewing mentioned to me that in describing his ideal marriage mate, he said, "Well, I want a homie lover friend," and then that's an old R. Kelly song, right? And so again, talking about a person who is a combination of, again, as he alluded to, a homie, a friend, a sort of a companion, but also someone who he could have a more intimate connection and relationship from a physical standpoint. So indeed, it was a case that large numbers of the men that we talked to and we engaged, they were influenced and impacted by hip hop culture. Some of it in positive ways, in other ways maybe less than positive.
So those examples that you just gave, obviously positive references, to positive lyrics where men are talking about women, whether you call it a ride or die chick or my day one chick or whatever. It is someone that's been there with them, been through thick and thin, ups and downs, and is going to be loyal. But what about so many of these lyrics? The word bitch is used like every other sentence, and in a derogatory way. What impact does a young man starting at 10 or 12 listening to those lyrics, how is that man going to interact and have respect for a woman if their images of what women are have been shaped and framed by what they hear in these lyrics?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be difficult. I think that certainly has an influence and has an impact. It shapes necessarily the way in which men come to their romantic relationships and the role that they see women playing in those relationships. I think that much of what happens in the media is that women tend to be objectified and seen as sort of vessels that are exclusively for male pleasure, right? Certainly that is troublesome and problematic. And it is completely the case that hip hop is complicit in that. So again, there's no way to discount that or refute that, because that's simply a matter of fact. Again, I feel like
do you think Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B and Nicki Minaj, that these female rap artists who are, bigger than life in the hip hop industry, and their approach, which is to claim, some of these, the words, the lyrics, do you think that their brand of feminism, which is to say, we're going to talk about it in the same way that you talk about it, we're going to make money off these lyrics in the same way that you do being the guys, what impact is that having? Because sometimes we hear men be, critical, like when WAP came out, Cardi B's song, a lot of black male rap artists were critical of that song and the, explicit nature of those lyrics. And when we saw, Cardi and Thee Stallion at the Grammys, many criticized their performance for being too sexually explicit. So how are men responding to women now who would say we're reclaiming our power, and some of the language that you've used for years, we now are using it, and we don't feel objectified by it?
Right. So I think that the first thing that comes to my mind is the idea that what's good for the goose may be good for the gander. What I think in that case, maybe what may be good for the gander may be good for the goose, but I think you get where I'm going there. I think that what was interesting to me was when WAP came out. I remember hearing, I think it was either Snoop Dogg or Jermaine Dupri with a critique, and I found that troublesome because, again, as a hip hop head, I'm familiar with both Snoop's and Jermaine Dupri's work,
right?
And they themselves, again, have engaged in the exact same behavior, the exact same lyrics, and so I'm not one to perpetuate, I think, misogyny and patriarchy in that way. So like there was a part of me that is sort of on the sideline cheering as I see women sort of embracing their sexuality, owning their sexuality, and saying, rather than be objectified, I will take agency, right, and ownership of my own, not only my own body, obviously, but my craft and my art, and I'll present and create my own narrative about who and what I am. Now, independent of whether I agree with the content, from a larger perspective about how it is that people, again, take agency and take ownership of whatever their narratives are. Again, I think that is part and parcel to who I am as a person and Black people's experience here in this country. Like we started out talking about that, the idea that the larger society has shaped and molded us and turned us into what it is they wanted us to be. And so a part of the sort of resistance culture that has always been a part of African American communities has been about reclaiming and taking ownership, or at least attempting to do that, and then telling our stories in ways that we see fit to do. And so women doing that in the context of hip hop culture, I would applaud that, whether it be Cardi, whether it be Nicki Minaj, and even some of the pioneers, the Salt and Peppers and the MC Lights, and some of my favorites, Queen Latifah's, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, I stand an ovation for me.
No, fantastic. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I want to talk about a couple of examples you give in the book. I think one example you gave is a man that shared some previous trauma that created challenges for his relationships. This man had been sexually assaulted by his babysitter. I don't think enough is talked about in terms of Black men and sexual trauma that they experience. It's a very hush-hush topic, and how that kind of trauma can influence their relationships. How difficult was it for that man to talk about being sexually assaulted by his babysitter?
Yeah, that entire chapter, we ended up dedicating a full chapter to just the ways in which trauma influenced people's attitudes and perspectives and relationship experiences. And what's interesting about that is I never set out to ask questions about trauma. right? I was just talking to the men about their experiences, and in sharing their experiences and telling their stories, these things came out over and over and over again. So much so that I felt compelled to take those quotes and turn it into a chapter. That's just how prevalent and how frequent these traumas were. And in the case of the specific man that you make reference to, he was, and again, in sharing his story, he talked about having some early relationship experiences where he was involved with multiple women, and in some cases didn't treat them as well as he knew he should have. And then in the midst of one of the interviews, he says to himself, I just realized that all of these women had a striking resemblance to a babysitter who abused him as a child. So it was in that moment, right, in the middle of the interview, where he had come to grips with some of his previous trauma and the way in which it followed him. And we talk about baggage, like he had been carrying that throughout his entire adolescence and his early adulthood and even into middle-aged adulthood. And so what we found in talking to guys over and over again was that they had been wrestling oftentimes with unresolved traumas, unchecked traumas, unaddressed traumas. And as you alluded to, unfortunately, in the Black community, there's oftentimes stigma attached to whether it be mental health treatment, and there's also, for some reason, seemingly a propensity to want to keep family business in-house. Yeah. Right. And sometimes what happens in the house needs to be shared outside of the house so that the people inside of the house who've been victimized can become whole again, or can at least begin a healing process. And hopefully it's through chapters like this and discussions like this where we can raise awareness about what's going on in our community so that people can be more open and more willing and more receptive to not only raising a hand and saying, hey, I've been harmed, I've been injured in these ways, so that they can begin to get access to the types of treatment and regimens that they need in order to become whole again.
Dr. Perry, I know you've done a lot of work on fatherhood and Black families. Did you find in the work for this book that there was any difference in the way these men approach relationships based on whether they were, raised in a house where they had a father? Because
absolutely,
it's not about how males who have fathers in their homes, and even women, that impacts how they approach relationships. What did you find about that issue about fathers in the home?
Absolutely. What we found was that guys who had positive relationships with their dads had a model to emulate, and they would talk openly, again, without even being asked, right? They would talk openly about going about their business in ways that were attempts to model what it was that they had received from their fathers. And it was also the case that, contrarily, guys who didn't have active fathers found themselves oftentimes lost, right? There was a young man who I talked to who was a college graduate at the time. He was 22 years old, had just graduated with a degree in accounting, and he was engaged to be married, and he was simultaneously super excited about his impending marriage, but he was also scared to death. And he talked to me about the idea that he did not have a close connection with his father. His father had to simply disengage from his family. His mother had been married and divorced 3 times. And so he said to me, he says, Doc, I don't know that what needed to be poured into me was in me. And so I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And so he's already engaged to be married. And on one side of his mouth, he's saying how excited he is, but on the other side of his mouth, he's also talking about, I don't think this is going to last. I'm happy to report that in subsequent interviews, he talked to me about how early on things were a struggle, and how he felt like a sense of insecurity, and that he would regularly check in with his then wife to say, how am I doing? Almost like a performance evaluation, right? Like, how am I doing? Like, are you okay? Like, are you good? And like to the point where he felt sort of needy and clingy in terms of regularly and routinely seeking her approval about how it was he was performing as a husband. And it was all because he didn't have much in terms of a model to be able to pull from. And oftentimes it's the case where when we're at a loss for what we do, we sort of automatically default to what was done with or to us by our family of origins. But the question then becomes, if you didn't have that, there's nothing to default to, and what do you do?
But did you also see a correlation? I'm thinking of a relative of mine that married a man who on the surface was ideal, had graduated from a historically Black college, had a great job, came from a family where the parents had been married for 40 plus years, all the siblings college, just looked like the perfect picture, but the father had been abusing the mother for years. And shortly afterwards, in the relationship with my relative, her husband became physically abusive. So did you see any correlation? So you just gave the example of those fathers, those guys who had fathers saying that they had a role model, something to follow. What about people who grew up, the men who grew up in homes where they saw men abuse their mothers? In the case of my relative, her husband grew up in an abusive household and he became an abuser. Did you see that kind of correlation as well?
So nothing like that came up with the guys that I studied, but I will say from some of my other fatherhood work, we talk about the difference between being present and having a presence, right? So in other words, again, I think to your point, oftentimes what we confuse being an active and a positive and a good dad with being a resident dad. Right. So in other words, people who live in the same house with their children or are married to their children's mother, there's a sort of an assumption or presumption that those guys are good dads and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing simply because they co-reside with their children and the children of the parent. But necessarily, in order to more accurately sort of dole out the title of a good dad or a good model or a good husband or a good partner, we need to take a more nuanced look and see what is the behavior, what is the sort of philosophy, what are the values that are being instilled, and what is it that we're showing the young people around us so that there's some consistency between what we're saying we're doing and what we're actually doing, rather than simply assuming or presuming that simply because one resides in the same house that he can check off either the fatherhood box or the husband box or the boyfriend box or the good partner box. So I think that's a really, really important point that needs to be examined further, I think.
Yeah, no, you make a great point about the presence, someone being present, and just their presence, the virtual being, just because you're there doesn't necessarily mean you are present in a way that has a positive impact on your children. Are you familiar with Dr. Diane Stewart's book, Black Woman, Black Love? It came out around the same time. I had her on the show, and she, gave a historical account in the book about why so few Black women are married. She traces the history of slavery and the breaking up of families that happened during slavery and following the emancipation. And then she looked at public policies, those in the 70s and that tore Black families apart. Black families that lived in housing projects where the fathers had to be excluded because the mother couldn't receive the benefit of staying in the housing project if the dad was there. What impact do you think some of those factors, be it structural racism, slavery, emancipation, and then some of those federal policies, what has those policies or structures done in your research? How have you found them to impact Black men and their relationships?
Sure. So the first thing I say is I am familiar with Dr. Stewart and her work. She and her work have been instrumental in influencing mine. So I consider myself lucky to have a relationship with her and to have been informed by her work. And I'm certainly familiar with her most recent book on Black women and the trajectory and the history of marriage and the ways in which, as she states, Black women are under sort of assault as it relates to marriage. So yeah, indeed, I am familiar with that, and I would completely agree with her that public policy has not been the friend to the Black family. You talked about, and again, I'm trained as a social worker, so I'm familiar with what used to be known as the man in the house rule, which is where social workers would make unannounced visits to families who were receiving public assistance, literally looking for any sign or any trace of a man, whether it be a razor, or whether it be boots, or whether it be a fedora or a hat, because if and when there was evidence that a man was residing in the house or spending time there, then the family would become ineligible for public assistance. And so what happened as a consequence of that is literally families were being forced to make decisions between whether or not they would continue to remain eligible for public assistance or be out in the open as it relates to whatever their relationships were. Now, considering the reality that America has always had a racist history and has never provided African-American men with the same opportunities to be providers and breadwinners as it has other men, it really put our families in a precarious situation because in some instances, and probably many instances, it was economically more viable for the family to remain eligible for public assistance than it was for them to remain intact in a way that was completely upfront and transparent. So certainly that is the case, that public policy was not our friend there. But even if we go back early, when you think about things like the Homestead Act, right, when most regular people, anyway, the biggest asset that they have is wrapped up in real estate and home ownership. And you think about it, in the early days of America, the federal government literally was just giving land away. But alas, Black people were not eligible, because when it first started, Black people were not citizens, right? But even in a second round of the Homestead Act, Black people in the southeastern portion of the country, where most Black people were concentrated, were not allowed to be eligible, right? And so you talk about the way in which intergenerational wealth grows over time, but in some cases, the gap gets wider and wider because some folks, particularly white people in America, had a much larger and much more significant head start over and beyond that of Black people. Other policies, we're talking about mass incarceration, quantity ratios, where mandatory minimum prison sentences started in the late 1970s and the early 80s, and we know that there are drastic disparities as it relates to the types of sentences people get for having drugs related to crack cocaine, which is disproportionately a low-income, people of color drug, versus powder cocaine, which is usually reserved for wealthy and affluent folks. And we could go on and on. We could spend a full semester talking about the ways in which public policy has shaped negatively the trajectories of African Americans here in this country, even up until the contemporary, when we're talking about voting rights and we're talking about the war on voting rights. The Supreme Court took a flamethrower to the Voting Rights Act a couple of years back and has allowed for many of what we see now, these voter suppression bills all over the country. And the pathway was laid for that a few years ago when the Supreme Court struck down portions of the Voting Rights Act that would have protected people's rights years ago.
Yeah, I want to ask you about, the research that says that marriage rates in general are on the decline, but a steeper decline for Black people. Did you find that the men in your study, what were their views about getting married, actually, entering into marriage, given that, the rates are falling, nationwide for marriage, in particular, as I said, with respect to Black people?
It made them scared and apprehensive.
Get married?
Yeah, it made them scared and apprehensive, I think. So people were aware. That was actually one of the questions. I would confront them with the data. The data suggests or indicate that, again, as you alluded to, marriage rates are going down, and they're going down more precipitously for African Americans. What does that mean for you as an African American male in the context of your romantic relationships? And the men were clear. It frightened them because what it suggested to them was that if other people aren't able to do this and be successful, why is it that I believe I'll be able to? And then when they looked around them in their circles of influence, whether it be friends or family members, and they knew of people who had been married and divorced or relationships didn't make it, the data hit closer to home then, right? And so it certainly had an impact on the guys, and not a positive one.
Is there anything that you have detected in your research or the work that you've done that would improve the way that Black men think about marriage, that would be encouraging to them as it relates to marriage?
Well, I think the project in and of itself is an artifact that I think can be encouraging for some, because as you read through the book, you get a more nuanced perspective on why it is that people think what they think. And it's also the case that 40% of the guys in the book were married, and many of them had been divorced but had been remarried, right? And so for whatever reason, things didn't work out the first time, but they learned from those experiences and were able to move on and find themselves in solid and sustainable relationships into the future. So I think that work like Black Love Matters, work like that of Dr. Diane Stewart and several others, I think all of those are artifacts that give us reason to be encouraged. I think the other thing is, if we can sort of re-envision or reimagine why it is that people are waiting longer to get married, if they ever get married. And I think for some people, they feel like, well, there's been a devaluing of marriage. And that's not been my experience. It's not that people devalue marriage or they don't hold marriage in high esteem anymore. That's not at all the case. I think the difference is between now and days gone by is that it used to be that people saw marriage as the beginning of their lives together. in a more contemporary context, people are seeing marriage as the culmination of two individuals who have become fully evolved. So in other words, you go and get yourself together, whatever that means for you. I'll go and get myself together, whatever that means for me. At the point in time when we both have ourselves together, you and I can meet at the altar and then we'll start our lives together. But in days gone by, people would get married and then they would deal with whatever came their way. So they were starting earlier. Now it's just a postponement because there's sort of a different orientation. But it's not a devaluing of marriage. So I think that's an important point.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I have two daughters, and one of my daughters met her boyfriend in high school, and they're still dating. They're both, he's headed to medical school, she's headed to law school. And her approach is just they met young, let's grow together, let's become successful together. My other daughter hasn't had a steady boyfriend. She's headed to law school, and she said exactly what you said. I'm going to get myself together, and he better have himself together, and then we'll come together, because we were kind of teasing her about, well, Michael, what if he's not already together? She says, well, he ain't the person for me. So, so I do think contemporary people, young people, my daughter, is my sample size here, agrees with you that, younger people, particularly if they haven't met in high school or very young, like my younger daughter, there is this sense that I'm going to work on me and you work on you, and then we'll see if we can, put these two well-developed, worked-on people together.
There you go. Yeah. And neither is wrong, right? It's just different, right? And so, again,
I think it matters, but your age, where you meet the person that you may be, inclined to want to be in a relationship with for the rest of your life. I want to ask you, back to your book, what do you think 3 of the biggest takeaways you hope people will get, who pick the book up, read it, and I hope my viewers will. I think a fascinating book. I'm just fascinated with that we are studying, and there's so much focus now on Black love, Black relationships. There are lots of docs on TV, lots of, TV shows that are focused on it, but to have this scientific and data-driven approach is really refreshing. So what are your 3 hopes that the takeaways will be?
Yeah, I think somewhat quickly, the first one I think we were just talking about, so it's almost a perfect segue. The first one is mate selection, right? I think for people in our community, mate selection is really, really important. I think that people should not be pressured into relationships. I think that there has been, because the larger and the broader society has stereotyped our sexuality and has controlled the narratives about our sexuality, there is a sort of implicit pressure in certain segments of the Black community to behave in ways that are seen as respectable as it relates to sexuality, right? So in other words, if you see a young lady and she is out on the town with Marvin on Monday and Larry on Tuesday and Sonny on Wednesday, there can be, right, an erroneous assumption that she is sort of less than moral or is promiscuous or whatever the case may be. But in reality, it may be that she's dating all of those guys because she's doing her due diligence to figure out not only who she is as a person, but also who they are as people, so that she can make a more informed decision. But because there is this, or has this been this history of stereotyping our sexuality, both Black men and Black women, many of us have been forced into relationships prematurely. And as a consequence to that, we don't realize that the person that we're with and we've been spending all this time with is not a good fit for us until it's too late. Right. And so, again, I think mate selection is really, really important. I think it's important for people to have.
I'm understanding you're saying that there's this forced kind of morality that we're following about who is a good person, who's a bad person. And oftentimes we're told we should be with the good person, even though that person may not be the right person for us. Oh, my God. I'm sitting here thinking about some couples that I know. I won't name any names, but someone who married a woman because she was considered the good person. And
absolutely,
it lasted, they had kids, but he got out of it. And he said he never really loved her, but she was the person that everyone said would make the perfect wife. And I would venture to say there are probably thousands, if not millions, of people who marry someone who society says is the good wife or good.
Absolutely. And again, when you use that term, the good wife, I think that's exactly it. Because again, I'm a son of the South. I'm from Alabama, and so the last thing you would want as a Black man growing up in the South is to attach yourself to a woman who's been considered as fast. I don't know if that language means.
Oh yeah, I grew up in St. Louis. I know what.
Okay, there you go. There you go. And so it speaks to the ways in which we moralize people's behavior and put them into boxes and so on and so forth. And some people are considered suitable and respectable, and other people, for whatever reason, aren't. And so, again, you talk about also the sexism that is rampant in our community. And while women get demonized for being quote unquote fast, the man who is engaging with those fast women gets glorified as.
I was going to say, oh, he's the man. He gets lifted up. He's put on a pedestal. He's revered in the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And he's vilified. She's the slut. She's the hoe. She's the tramp. She's, the thought, and every other word that they can think of.
Yeah.
That's got to change that narrative.
Absolutely.
That's toxic.
There's a lot of toxicity there. Yeah. So again, I would talk about
the perfect mate. That's your first takeaway. What's number 2?
Mate selection. Well, the second one is related to that, which has to do with removing the morality from these discussions. Okay. Right. I think that is really, really important for us. Right. Not that we suspend our morals, right, but that we remove morality from these discussions about relationships, so that people can be free to be their true and authentic selves. Because I think it's also the case that I think it was Chris Rock who once talked about the idea that when you first meet a person, you don't really meet them, you meet their representative. And some of that is about this external pressure to appear as if you are whatever the boxes are and to check those things off. But imagine a scenario in which you could meet a person, actually meet the true and authentic version of that person, you be your true and authentic self, and then, again, make an informed decision about whether or not that is something that you would want to sort of pursue. And I think that people would be freer, people would be liberated to be that way if there wasn't so much external pressure and stigma placed on moralizing people's behavior. And then the third thing, again, I think I've touched on this several times, but I think it's important to note here is, again, that any critique of Black families and Black relationships absolutely has to be accompanied by a critique of the larger society that shapes those relationships. Folks may be familiar with the notion that sometimes Black people, African Americans, behave as crabs in a barrel. Mm-hmm. But it is also the case that a barrel is not a crab's natural habitat. Right. So crabs are not meant to live in barrels, but indeed crabs find themselves in barrels because they are placed there involuntarily. And that is analogous to Black people's experience here in the United States. If you want an anthology on the Black experience in the U.S., it's essentially we've been plucked away from our home. We've been dropped off here. And since that time, we've been trying to make the best of what is less than an ideal situation. Some of us have been successful in that some ways, and others of us are still working on it. But all of us have the common experience of being pulled and plucked from our natural habitat and placed in a place that is foreign to us, never was set up for us to succeed, and up until this day is still not set up for us to succeed. And we're seeing more and more of it because the veil is being lifted, right? And so hopefully people are paying attention to that. And as they critique our families and our communities, they also critique the larger, broader society that shapes them.
And I'm glad you said that because, there's a popular YouTuber right now who's giving a lot of advice on Black love, Black relationships. And some of the advice is, straight through the lenses of white supremacists about what women should look like. And, if you're going to get a man, how you got to wear your hair and your body type. And my daughter has been listening to it and she's told me some of it. And, I've had to tell her, first of all, experts are experts for a reason. So let's check the credentials here. Sure. There are none. So check that box. So okay. For the expert title. And 2, so much of what this person is saying is through those white supremacist lenses about what Black women should look like and what they must do to attract a Black man. And so I think I am elated that we're having these very transparent, open, honest conversations about white supremacy and the impact that it has on everything that happens to us as Black people, including how we view, love relationships, marriage, and, obviously parenting and our familiar relationships. So I'm very, very glad to to see that you are also helping us understand that, we must put our relationships in this broader context. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. What a fascinating book, fascinating work. Everyone, the book is Black Love Matters, Authentic Men's Voices on Marriages and Romantic Relationships. If you want to know what Black men across the spectrum are thinking about Black love and Black relationships, check out this book. It's science-driven. He is an expert. He studied this. He knows what he's talking about, and just delightful to have an opportunity to sit down and talk with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Again, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Armon Perry, for writing such a thoughtful book and for engaging in this process of really talking to Black men and hearing from them exactly what Black love, relationships, and marriages mean. As he said, there are all of these images that are portrayed in the media and even that have been portrayed by academics that have done research on Black men. But those images that we see in the media don't portray the reality of what Black men are thinking. And I'm just so glad he had an opportunity to study, these 33 men, follow them for 4 years, talk to them about everything from sex to infidelity to, the physical body type that's important to them when they are selecting their mates. If you're lucky enough to be in a relationship with someone that you love, you are incredibly blessed. We know that Black women in particular are underrepresented as it relates to marriages and even in relationships. So hopefully books like Dr. Perry's and Dr. Stewart will shine a bright light on some of the issues and obstacles that Black women in particular face as it relates to love and relationships. And as he said, these pieces of work, these bodies of work are encouraging and hopefully will start to move the needle. Just some words to live by before I get out. The right person will make you fall in love with yourself. Think about that. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.